Welcome to Post-Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'm here to continue my conversation on William Faulkner's Sound and the Fury. Now, if you've been watching this series, I've already covered a general introduction to the novel. Then we covered part 1, which is on Benjy, and today I'll be talking about part 2, which focuses on Quentin Compson. Now, an important thing to keep in mind is that while all the other sections, the 3 sections, are set in 1928, this section actually is about June 2nd, 1910. So it's earlier than the other 3 sections. Another thing to keep in mind is that in this section, it's probably the longest section. It starts at page 76 and ends at page 178 or 179 in my edition of the novel. Now, this section covers, in terms of its temporality, temporal setting, one day in Quentin Compson's life. And that's the day that he actually plans and then eventually, as it is implied, it's not stated, commits suicide. That's the day that is captured over here. Now, if you read the Benjy section and struggled with how to make sense of it, you probably entered section 2 assuming that it would be easier than section 1. Actually, that's what I had thought. But actually, it's harder than section 1 or part 1 of the novel. And the main reason for that is that in this chapter, Faulkner is being the most experimental with stream of consciousness. And it becomes clearly evident because one aspect of stream of consciousness, if you've read about it, you already probably know, is that the author is trying to capture how a character's mind works. So you will run into sentences where it doesn't absolutely make sense because there are no punctuations, there are no transitions from one time period to another. In one sentence, you could be in the present, in the next sentence, you are somewhere in the past, and you as a reader has to then make sure that you try to figure out where you are. So my suggestion to my students is, and that's what I followed too, is to constantly annotate the book, pointing it to yourself as to where you are. So I constantly marked where we were in the present, and then I went on to highlight when we make shifts from present to the past. And that kind of gives a general map as you read the section. Now, if you were to imagine this section, just imagine that Quentin is at the center of it. We start in the present. He has just woken up. He's talking about listening or hearing the watch. He is constantly concerned with time. In opposition to Benjy, whose experience of reality was almost timeless, right? So Quentin is obsessed with time. And he also relies on memories of his conversations with his father giving him a lot of wisdom words. To me, they come across as mock wisdom, as something that is not to be taken seriously, maybe a bit pompous, but you can read it and then make up your mind what you think. So in the present of part 2, Quentin wakes up. If I were to talk about the plot, he takes his watch to a clock shop, asks the clock master about which time was correct on one of the several clocks, doesn't give his watch for fixing, then finds Dean, who is an attendant at Harvard, and gives him a letter, right, for Shreve. He posts a letter, and then he takes a tram car outside the city. And he goes to the river where the river is almost entering the ocean. In the process, before he leaves the city, he also buys 2 iron weights, kind of like irons. And there are hints that he is looking for the ideal spot, which he finds and hides under the bridge, the iron weights, as he's thinking about how they would eventually float up. But this is all done in a really subtle way. But he is literally mapping the path that he will take and the spot that he will use to eventually commit suicide. As he's returning from there, he has different kinds of adventures, right? We are privy to his views, highly racist views of Black people. We also see him interact with a young Italian girl whom he runs into in a bakery, who is lost, and he's trying to find her house. And we are given a glimpse into how the Italian immigrants at that time are viewed by the majority population, right? And they are not viewed very positively. Gets arrested for supposed kidnap of the young girl, but then that's when his friends from Harvard who were picnicking that day find him, and then he ends up being with them in a car. And eventually, because of one of his friends, or not friends, but college fellows, Gerald's views on women, he gets into a scrape with him and gets beat up, right? At least he's bleeding, and he goes back to his room, meticulously cleans his vest, takes a shower, cleans himself, leaves a letter for, actually doesn't leave the letter for Shreve, takes it with him, and there is a mention of the post office on the way. And all we know by the end of this section is that he has walked out of his Harvard apartment and he is on his way, fully dressed, looking nice. And we can construe that he is on his way back to the spot that he had picked up. That's roughly the present of part 2. Now, there's a lot going on through memories and flashbacks in part 2. Part of what we learn through his flashbacks and memories is his relationship with his father, right? That the father tries to give him some advice, some wisdom about how to deal with virginity, how to think about time, right? How to enjoy life even. And that we learn that the father had sold the pasture to pay for his Harvard education. We also have a repeat views of that day when Benji, Caddy, and they all play in the stream, right? So we hear that again. Then a major part of this section is his reflections on his relationship with Caddy. Now remember, Benji is obsessed with Caddy, but his love for Caddy is more, I would say, natural, it's dependent, and Benji is intuitive about his relationship with Caddy. Quentin's relationship with Caddy is more problematic. It almost has incestual tones and obsessive tones about it. He obviously loves Caddy, but he's also jealous of her promiscuity, right? And her relationships with other men. So a lot of the memories that they have are the memories of Quentin and Caddy talking about what's going to happen to her, how many men have been there in their lives. And there is a point where Quentin actually offers her, we could run away, we could use this money that is for my college and live off of it. So a lot of memories of Caddy. There are 2 fights that Quentin loses. I mean, they're not really fights. I mean, he gets punched or he's very ineffectual. The first one is when he asks Dalton Ames, the guy who had gotten Caddy pregnant, to meet on the bridge. They both ride up there. Actually, he walks there, and Dalton Ames rides up there. There is no fight. Dalton is much more stronger than Quentin, and he treats Quentin like a boy. Maybe he makes him feel emasculated. So that's the first scene where he makes Caddy's honor a reason for a fight and a challenge. The second fight is towards the end on the same reason, because Gerald is talking ill of women. He is a womanizer. And Quentin famously, as he had said to Dalton Ames, do you have no sister? And they fight, and Quentin gets punched. And, he's bleeding as Shreve takes care of him, and he goes back to his apartment. So the characters that are mentioned or that appear in this section, of course, the mother, the father, Benji is mentioned, Jason is mentioned, Caddy, of course, is a big present, but then are his Harvard characters, Harvard colleagues, Shreve, who is his closest friend. Then we have Spode, I think he's a Canadian, Gerald, who is sort of a playboy, and Gerald's mother, right, who really loves her son and, drives around with her son. And then we meet Deacon, who is kind of a custodian, but he's also the guy who provides different kinds of services to the students, right? And he's very entrepreneurial. That's how he is represented. So these are some of the characters in this section. Now, I briefly already mentioned how to read it. But remember, this is a modernist novel, right? This is not something that you pick up and read at a train station. The way a modernist novel, and especially this one, the way they are crafted are as pieces of art, right? And they require that kind of careful reading. So when you start reading it, you probably already read part 1, maybe you're reading it for your class, and when you read part 2, please have your own copy of the novel and annotate. Keep reminding yourself where you are and look up things. There are classical references, a couple of them in this one too, which I probably have missed, but if you pose a question, I'll be happy to answer it, but you have to read it with that kind of care. So overall, Quentin's section, we can construe that on this day he commits suicide. But there is no harrowing scene of suicide. All we see is his meticulous preparation. We also get a sense of his mental state and maybe his way of thinking of himself and of life that could have made him prone to suicide. Which also tells us that part of this family's life, right, is all the characters in it are traumatized characters, right? In a way, they may be paying the price for the past ills of their family. We could read it like that too. But in personal lives, they're all traumatized characters. They carry different kinds of trauma, and they have different kinds of coping strategies. Quentin's is to be obsessive about time, to be meticulous, and that comes across pretty clearly in his meticulous planning of his eventual suicide. So these are all some of the thoughts I have about part 2. It's not much, but obviously that's all I can offer, and I, with the hope that you will carefully read this section and then talk about it, and especially pay attention to the language and the vocabularies employed and how part of this section is deeply philosophical. For example, one reference is to St. Francis, where he talks about death being the other sister, right? So death being a sister as something that you await in the end, and it meets everyone. that references in the very beginning of part 2, but also in this case, maybe tangentially, the cause of his death is what he feels towards his sister, which he tries to sublimate into a fight for honor. But as you read carefully, you can see that it's some sort of obsession and maybe sexual obsession. Now we know that Quentin is a virgin, right? And that anxiety is already part of his conduct. And that's what his dad tells him. Look, you don't understand these things happen. So we have to keep that in mind as well. We also have to keep in mind the time frame. This is 1910. Okay, so this is not even the present temporality of the rest of the sections. This is 10 years before that. So these are some of the things that I've gleaned from part 2. I hope these are useful to you. If you have any questions, anything that you would like me to elaborate further, please feel free to post it in the comments, and I'll be very happy to respond to any of your queries and questions. The playlist in which this video is included will come up shortly. Please click on it and see what other videos are available. Thank you so much. Stay safe, take care, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.